And our next speaker has spent 20 years analysing mobile, digital media and technology, and has worked in equity research, strategy, consulting and venture capital. Today he's an independent analyst based in London. His weekly newsletter is a highlight of the week for many of us, as it helps us understand what's happening in technology, what actually matters and what it all means. Please welcome Benedict Evans.
So thank you for all of that. I hope you all realise how tremendously lucky you are to have me speaking to you. I'm actually not going to give you my camera. I think it's much more interesting to show you some slides and talk about where I feel the tech industry is today as we go from essentially an unregulated industry to a regulated industry. So I'm afraid a much more down-to-earth topic than finding sort of extraterritorial life. But on the other hand, if you're in the tech industry, regulation probably also feels, frankly, like something of a, like something of an alien industry. So I think an good sort of opening way of thinking about this is this quote from Perry Barlow from 1996, just as the consumer internet was starting to happen. "Governments of the industrial world, weary giants of flesh and steel, you are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." Because technology and the internet was this new space, and somehow all the old rules seem to not apply or not matter in any sense. 20 years later, that wasn't really how people thought about it anymore. After Brexit, after the US election, after a whole bunch of other things, we kind of shifted to a different way of thinking about what this stuff might mean. And so I think a lot of the conversation of the last 4 or 5 years has been, how do we think about that? How do we understand that? How does technology fit into a world of public policy? And how does technology get regulated? And I think really the place to start in thinking about this is to understand how small the tech industry was until really very recently. When Apple launched the Mac back in 1984, the entire global PC industry, of course, Apple IIs, IBM compatibles, Commodores, everything else, all of those companies combined sold about 6.5 million units on the entire planet. So the entire PC market was 6.5 million units. When Netscape launched in 1994, there were maybe 75 to 100 million PCs on Earth, and 3/4 of those were in big companies. And so there were maybe 25 million consumer PCs on Earth. And again, half of those were in the USA. Today, about 4, maybe 4.5 billion people have a smartphone. And you can argue a little bit about how many of those people are online and what they pay for bandwidth and what they pay to charge their phone. But we've gone from a world in which technology and software and the internet was exciting and interesting, and you might start a magazine about it, which you would probably call Wired rather than Wireless, of course. But it wasn't an important part of most people's lives. And that's changed pretty fundamentally since then, and really kind of in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think the best way of understanding that is this chart, which is a study of how Americans meet their partners. And this is actually a study that goes back to the 50s. And what it tells you is that in 2017, 40% of new relationships in the USA began online. That's straight relationships. Gay relationships are much higher. Last year it was probably 50%. This year it's probably 90%. And so the internet has gone from something interesting and exciting, but not part of everybody's life, to something that's a normal part of how everybody lives their life every day. I think if you think about kind of the 50-year progress here, technology and computers and software used to be giant boxes from IBM that big companies bought that got used by white men in coats, generally lab coats, to process their accounts. And slowly over the last 50 years, that has diffused out from a few hundred big companies to 4 billion people and to every aspect of everybody's life, from databases through to Salesforce, and then, of course, out and through to Tinder. And so if you think about kind of the generational changes that have come over the last 50 years, we had mainframes, and then we had PCs, and then we had the web, and then smartphones brought computing to everybody on Earth. And the next generational change, the change we're living through now, is that technology becomes a systemically important part of society. It becomes part of everybody's life. Now, the events of this year are really just accelerating or crystallizing or kind of making all of that apparent. In the UK, which has had one of the more dramatic accelerations and also, of course, has some of the best data. If you look at UK retail sales in this year, they've gone now to they've stepped up from about 30%. E-commerce has stepped from 30% of retail, excluding groceries, at the beginning of this year. It's now about 40% of retail, excluding grocery. And so e-commerce and the internet in general has kind of taken over. And so we have this phrase, software is eating the world, which was coined by my old boss, Mark Andreessen, 7 or 8 years ago. The problem is that all the world's problems get expressed in software. Because everybody uses this, and therefore all the bad people use it, and all of our own bad instincts get brought onto it as well. And so we have to think, well, how do we live in a world in which Beavis and Butthead are on the internet, not just John Perry Barlow? This problem isn't going to get any easier. So these images are generated by a neural network, by a machine learning engine. So none of these are real people. These people don't exist. And so if you think dealing with misinformation or content moderation or social networks is difficult now, it's not going to get any easier. It's going to get much more complicated, much more interesting, much more difficult. Now, part of our conversation in the last few years, and a natural part of any of these kind of conversations, has been a certain kind of a panic. And this image was created in the early 20th century when people realized quite what might be happening in the world of industrialized food. That your sausages might contain pork, but they might have been sitting in a warehouse with a leaky roof for 6 months, and they might have picked the rats out before they shoveled the meat into the sausage machine, or they might not. And so there's a great moment of panic around the food industry that creates ultimately what we now call the FDA. That creates health inspections, sanitary inspections, refrigeration requirements, ingredients lists, all sorts of regulations of what it is that goes into our food. And if you kind of generalize this and think about the evolution of technology and indeed the evolution of industry over the last 150 years or so, we've had a wave of new technologies that were very important, very beneficial to humanity, that also kill people or cause problems. And we regulate them. And so we regulated railways, we regulated food, we regulate ships and aircraft and cars, we regulated databases, and now we're going to regulate the internet. And I think that really this concept of regulation should be thought of that there are industries that are subject to kind of general purpose regulation. And so if you're a book publisher and you kill one of your colleagues, you kill your author, and you steal some money, you don't get arrested by the book publisher's regulator, except maybe in France. I think France has a book regulator. But anywhere else, you're just subject to criminal law and accounting law. But there's a whole bunch of very specialized industries that do have very specific industry regulation. This chart is an attempt to index just how regulated specific industries are in the USA. And so oil and gas, fishing, airlines, finance, oil refining are all regulated industries, and cars are regulated industries. And I think we would all understand that there are a whole bunch of kind of interesting technical questions about how you regulate a car. But the challenge is that we don't actually regulate the car industry. We regulate all sorts of different questions. And safety is not the same kind of a problem as drink driving. You can go to General Motors and tell them to do something about emissions. You can't go to General Motors and tell them to stop teenage boys driving too fast, or to put up more parking meters in central London, or to create more car parks, or to put a congestion charge in Manhattan. There are all sorts of different questions, and those need different kinds of problem that need to be understood in different kinds, and a solution that needs to be understood in different kinds of ways. The same thing applies to technology. There is not a technology problem. There are 20 technology problems, or internet problems, or social media problems. There are questions of political advertising that have nothing really to do with face recognition and nothing really to do with ride sharing. And if you go to Amazon and tell them that Airbnb is pushing up house prices in Barcelona, they'll say, well, maybe, but we're not Airbnb. That's not anything we can do something about. And so you kind of have to pull these questions apart and work out, well, which problem are we thinking about here? At this moment, we often get this phrase, break them up. And since I'm talking to you from the UK, I'll sort of make the observation that break them up reminds me a great deal of Brexit. It sounds very simple. You'll just leave. We'll break up, we'll exit. And then you say, yes, but leave into what? Break up into what? And what problem exactly would that be solving? And why? And are you sure? If we kind of dig down on that just for a moment, supposing we break up Facebook, supposing we split Instagram or YouTube into separate companies, well, that's great for the advertisers because now there's more competitive tension, and in fact, they can demand more private information. And so there'll be more competition in the ad market. But that's not going to result in 10 more photo sharing apps. If YouTube wasn't owned by Google, we wouldn't have 10 more video sharing websites. These companies are powered by network effects that are internal to that product. They're not a consequence of competition law. And so you have to ask yourself as well, what problems are they that we're worried about? And are the solutions that we're talking about going to address the problems that we worry about? Or are they going to address something else? Do people worry about big tech because Google and Facebook might be overcharging WPP? Or are we worried about other questions that might need some other kind of solution? In other words, it's more useful to ask, well, what kind of a problem is that exactly? Is this a competition problem? Sometimes it is. Is it actually a technology problem? Or is that actually like a financial services problem, or a labor law problem, or a municipal government question, or a regulation of public transit question? Then you should think, well, where does the responsibility for this sit in the tech stack? Do we want Apple to moderate content inside social networks because they're on the App Store? Do we want Cloudflare to moderate content on social networks? Whose job exactly is it to solve that question? We can't ask a construction company to solve parking. That's a municipal government question. So who solves this? And then at a higher level, who is it that should be deciding this? And what is it that we want to do anyway? Are we actually sure that we know what we want? I think a kind of profound, important way to think about this is that most of these questions are trade-offs. So we want competition in social media. We also want our information to be protected. So if you want a competing social network, it should be easy to export your data and your interests and your friends and all of your friends' interests. If you want more privacy, it should be impossible to do that. We want secure private messaging. We also want the police to be able to look for criminals. We want open platforms, and we want random companies to be kept out of our personal data. So there are all sorts of kind of trade-offs and conflicts where we have to work out, well, there's several different things that we want, and you can't have all of those at once. I think a really interesting way of expressing this question comes when we talk about moderating content, we have very different attitudes to what content moderation might look like in different countries. It's not just China versus liberal democracies. Liberal democracies themselves have different ideas of what free speech is, different ideas of what kinds of content should be acceptable and not acceptable. This is a great case study from a couple of weeks ago, from October. Mahathir Mohamad, who's a major politician in Malaysia and a two-time former prime minister, was commenting on controversy in French politics and came out with this line: Muslims have a right to be angry and to kill millions of French people. Okay, if you're a 35-year-old product manager in Menlo Park, what do you think about that? Are you sure? Should this be your decision? Who is it exactly that should decide how speech works globally? Should a small private company or even a public company in California or in Brazil or in China be making decisions about how speech works globally? And of course, globally is the crucial question, because this isn't about regulation in one country anymore. We have at least three major regulatory jurisdictions: the USA, the EU, and China. We have a whole bunch of other places creating their own regulations, and many of those regulations get applied globally. GDPR applies globally. CCPA from California applies globally. So we have all sorts of competition amongst regulation, and competition that conflicts and overlaps and competes with each other. Meanwhile, if you're an American company, so you still have people telling you that you should read the American Constitution, but 80 to 90% of your users aren't in America anymore. And so that isn't really a great guide for how you think about the future. And, again, to generalize this question of globalization, if you go back 10 years ago, 80 to 90%, say 70 to 80% of all the venture capital investment on Earth was happening in California. Most interesting new companies were being created in California. But that's not true anymore. Now it's more like 50-50. And so the Americans can't presume that the next interesting social network will be created in California or in the USA. This is really the structural question around Zoom. It's a structural question around TikTok. You can't bet on shareholders. You can't bet on people being in California or in New York anymore. You have to think structurally about where all of this stuff is going to come from. Again, if we think about where technology is today, and this kind of reiterates the point I made at the beginning, there are more smartphones in China today than in the USA and Western Europe combined. There are more smartphones in India than in the USA. In fact, I think the most interesting or most entertaining thing about this chart is that I put North America into rest of world. Consequently, we should think about the future of technology, the future of the regulation of technology, as being complicated, systemically complicated. This is a chart of financial services regulation, and just one part of financial services regulation. Technology is going to look a lot like that over the next 5 or 10 years. So if I pull some of these threads together, this is a screenshot of Donald Trump's Twitter feed the day after the election. Every single one of his posts has been blocked out by Twitter. 5 years ago, Twitter said they were the free speech wing of the free speech party. They don't think like that anymore. In the 1970s and early 80s, we worried about technology in the same way. We worried about databases. We worried about what databases and access to data and ability to index and scan people might do to civil liberties. And some of that was panic, but some of it was a real issue, and we created a whole bunch of laws and regulations about how that would work. Today, we're going through a similar kind of process. Part of that change is that the tech industry itself has changed its attitude. 5 years ago, the tech industry would have said censorship is bad and we can't moderate anyway. Now, everyone agrees you have to moderate, and everyone agrees that it's possible, at least up to a point. But there are also still some things that you can't do. We still can't make a secure platform with a back door. You're going to have to pick one of those things. And so that gets you to an understanding of the regulation of technology that actually looks like the regulation of everything else. The things you can have, the things you can't have. You can ban tobacco ads, but you can't ban inflation or ban unemployment. You can try to stop fraud, but you're not going to be able to get rid of all of it. And really, this is how policy works. We're going through a journey of understanding the complexity, the trade-off, the difficulty, and the downright confusion that applies to every other kind of policy getting applied to technology as well. The only certainty, I think, that comes out of that is that all this is going to be expensive. This is a chart showing you the impact of regulation on American banks of different sizes. Regulation is a regressive tax. The smaller you are, the more difficult it is to comply with it. And so regulation, amongst other things, conflicts with competition. The more regulation there is, the better things are for Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. And so I'll leave you with just one final point, which is a hope for the future. This is Ted Cruz endorsing something said by AOC, which may be a sign of future, or a sign of hope for the future, a sign of optimism. It may also be a sign that we're now in the end times, when we should expect human sacrifice to come next. Certainly mass hysteria. And with that, I will say thank you.